Welcome to The Road to Zero, a future-proof podcast, as we explore the changing nature of our economy as we look for prosperity and opportunity in not only preserving, but also improving our environment. Today on The Road to Zero, we are talking to Christina Seidel, the Executive Director of the Recycling Council of Alberta, and also the owner of Sonnevera International. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. And to start, can you tell us a little bit of what is the circular economy?
It's a very, believe it or not, a complicated question because everybody makes a lot of assumptions about what it is based on what the terminology is. But really, the important thing about circular economy is it's not just about recycling. So circular economy is a much more holistic concept that embraces just a much more effective way of us utilizing resources and keeping products and materials in the system as long as possible. But one of the key ways of doing that is to actually redesign. So we need to look at how we design things, and we need to design them better so that we're not designing them to be waste, but rather we're designing them to be an integral part of the economy. And part of that is making sure that we're working with the natural systems, that we're not creating undesired impacts on the natural environment. So those things are all a key part of circular economy.
Okay. And I can't wait to dive into that, but I'd like to know a little bit about what got you into this conversation of the circular economy. How did you kind of make your way into this field?
Well, it's interesting because I've been in this industry for a long time, a lot longer than most people. So I have seen people's attitudes, and I've seen the assumptions and terminology change over the years. And it was interesting because, I mean, we've called what we do and what we want to do many different things. We've called them, symbiosis. We've called them basically, the common 3 R's like recycling. We landed fairly. One of the most recent terminologies that was used was the concept of zero waste. And that's one that we embraced for years because it really made sense for what we were trying to accomplish. And then circular economy emerged not that long ago, actually, just a very few years ago, the concept of circular economy came up. And I remember thinking, oh, for crying out loud, are we just going to rename the same thing all over again? We're just going to call it something else, but it's the same thing. But so it actually took me a while to really embrace it. But when I started to really see how people and businesses and governments were responding to the concept, I realized that this is not just the same old thing. This actually is a new paradigm that we need to embrace. So since then, certainly, I have been very supportive. And as I'd mentioned, the Recycling Council of Alberta has been very supportive too, to the point of basically redefining our mission to be about circular economy rather than about recycling.
Yeah, it's a really interesting nuance there. And just to dig into that, of what is the difference from recycling or zero waste to circular economy? What's the big shift in that paradigm that you see? Well, it sounds like it'll be something that makes a bigger difference. So what is that nuance?
Yeah, and I think I'd have to say a lot of it is about how holistic it is. So it's a more encompassing term. It embraces a much broader concept in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. So the fact that we're actually trying to improve natural systems and embrace natural systems, and perhaps the most important thing is that we're not just looking at dealing with materials when we're done with them. We're looking at redesigning the systems, redesigning products, so that we really are trying to design a system so that we don't inevitably have waste. So we don't want to just be able to recycle something a couple of times and then it still ends up going to disposal. Rather, we want whatever we design to be able to be an integral part of the system for a very long time.
Okay, so yes, I see really the big difference is, not handling it at the waste end and doing something with it, but it's literally at the front end, figuring out what you're going to do, what's left over, and how can you eliminate it by design.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting because part of what has allowed us to do this is that there our system really has evolved to the point where there are big differences now to what it used to be. And so the approaches that are really being embraced under circular economy now are approaches that actually really used to exist many years ago. You know, things like materials, products having longevity, but there's also new concepts. Well, not completely new, but new now, like product as a service as opposed to a product. And so a number of these new approaches actually are quite enabled by the new technology that we have. And that has allowed us to do this as well. But the other thing that has happened is because of a number of these approaches not only being new, but being, requiring some of the new technological approaches that we have, they actually end up being, some of them are highly disruptive. And so that's a part of this new paradigm too, is that it is so not the same old. It really is, in many cases, fairly disruptive to the point where it may even not completely right now fit in with some of our policies and some of our standard approaches. So we need to make sure that we embrace this ability to actually look at new approaches that we would normally see as disruptive.
Yeah. And what I hear in that, like the best example is that old milkman example with the bottles, the returnable bottles that you're starting to see come back. And I'd love to hear, and I'm seeing that in a lot of other places too, where that whole reusing of the whole package and returning. But I'd like to hear some more of like that disruptive side, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives that you guys are taking on in Alberta, and maybe tell us how you're bringing that into existence.
Sure, and the whole milk example is such a good one because that is in reference to a new approach that's called Loop, where it actually is that reuse concept. And so it's important for us to recognize that we're not really reinventing everything, we're just kind of repackaging it, because we have always said that the waste hierarchy is critical, and we need to always respect the waste hierarchy, and reuse is above recycling. So we want to reuse where we can. But our systems, the way that we've had them for decades now, really don't properly allow reuse. Reuse almost doesn't really fit very well anymore. So the idea that we can actually do that again through systems like Loop, where you can go and you can actually buy your ice cream in a container that you pay a deposit on, and then you take it back when you're done with it. And not only does it get reused, but you actually have a way nicer container that you get to eat your ice cream out of than you ever did if you were not part of this system. So it has all of these environmental benefits associated with it, because reuse by definition, again, is higher in the hierarchy. So we want to embrace that. So that's such a good example of how something like that really is quite disruptive within the system that we've been used to for decades. But it is better, and we are now proving that it can work. So it's going to be very interesting. One of the challenges with disruptive approaches is you're never really sure how exactly they're going to work and how they're going to be accepted. So this is, there's lots of other examples too. Like, the whole idea of what we have traditionally looked at as leasing, for example, but instead that we would actually be able to share things as opposed to everybody having to go buy things. So the idea of sharing tools, sharing cars, that we don't have to have our own car necessarily if we live in the city. These are all approaches that are very different from the way it has been for years, but they haven't all, some of them have almost been a little bit ahead of their time, I think. But I think you will see some of these ones that we've lost reemerge again, because people are really trying to embrace these new approaches.
Yeah, and you're seeing them more and more. I know the car share, you're seeing that popping up so much. And even the tool sharing, I think I live in Victoria, and I think there might be a tool sharing. I know before COVID, at least there was. I don't know what happened after COVID. That might have disrupted things a bit, but you definitely start seeing toy libraries, and you're seeing tool libraries pop up, which is definitely really interesting.
Absolutely. Like tool libraries used to be what we used, only a couple of years ago as like, this is the really cool example. We're going to use tool libraries. And we would always use Toronto Tool Library because they were one of the first big ones. But honestly, now you'd have a hard time finding a city that does not have a tool library. So once these concepts really prove themselves, then they really start to take hold. And tool libraries is a good example. But the car sharing one is an example of how sometimes these things can be disruptive and be a bit ahead of their time, because Car2Go, look at Car2Go, which is basically, it's gone now, which is very unfortunate because what an amazing approach. There are replacements now that are stepping up. Like it really paved the way for some of these new companies now that are doing the same thing, but just in a slightly different way. So again, one of the dangers you have with being disruptive is there certainly is a high risk associated with being disruptive, but we have to make sure that whatever we do, that we embrace the disruption rather than resist it. And that's something that things like regulation and governments don't necessarily do really well, is embrace disruption. So that's something that we need to get better at.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you see the ones that, the high risk ones that pave the way, and either it works or it doesn't work. And if it works well, sometimes then they're the market leaders, which is great. And then after that, everybody kind of follows suit and they do fairly well. And what kind of initiatives specifically have your organization been working on, or what are kind of your pet projects or that you've got on the go?
Thank you for asking, because we're actually really excited about the project that we are engaged in now, and that is related to circular communities. The concept, when we started it, is usually called circular cities, but because we're looking at not just cities but towns and possibly even institutions, we are calling it circular communities, because we want to make sure we embrace all levels of community. And so what we're doing, the idea of circular communities, circular cities, is where the people are. That is where most of the resources are used. Like in Alberta, for example, 80% of the people actually live in cities. So if you're going to make a difference in terms of people's, what people are involved in, people's behaviors, really cities is your big opportunity. But one of the big things for us is, again, back to the idea of governments and whether or not governments are embracing some of these new ideas. Cities are just so much more nimble than higher level government. So if you want to get something to happen, it's going to take you a very long time to get it to happen at the federal level, and a long time as well at a provincial level, less perhaps than federal. But in terms of the ability to do something quickly, cities really can be quite nimble, especially if they're motivated. So the idea of trying to use cities as the entry point for circular economy initiatives, because of their nimbleness, as well as the fact that that's where so much happens, just made a lot of sense to us. And so we've done a bunch of research on things that had happened in other communities around the world, and put together the idea of, okay, how do we bring this to Alberta? How do we introduce the idea of circular economy so that cities and towns can embrace it, and how can we encourage that? So that's what this project is about, and we've been working on that now for over a year, and it has been quite successful, and actually, interestingly enough, because of its success, has now just gone national. So now what we have done in Alberta now has been adopted by some national organizations that we're working with to try to bring this same concept to a number of cities and towns across the country.
That's a really awesome example where, like in Alberta, it can be leading the country in a lot of these initiatives, right? Because I have to say, I'm really amazed at the amount of innovation, in Alberta. And it's amazing what is going on under the surface. And for example, for this initiative, is there any particular city, or have you been successful in integrating this in multiple cities across Alberta?
Yeah. So what we did actually, it all started again with us researching what was going on in other places, and we have a large waste reduction conference that we hold every year. And we actually brought in a Circular Cities speaker to talk about this, because we thought, this is really cool. We should introduce this to some of our people. And our people got so excited that we had municipalities basically coming up to us after saying, you know what, we can do this here. And we would like to look at how we can do this here. So what we did is we brought in a number of communities and got them engaged. So we have the City of Edmonton, the City of Calgary, Strathcona County, Town of Banff, and City of Lethbridge, and brought them all together as this first step to see how we can make this work. And that is what's gotten traction. And this is what, again, we are looking at spreading across the country, because once we got those communities really keen and they looked really seriously at how they could look at what's happening in their municipality and how they can embrace some circular economy concepts and making themselves more progressive in the process and really embracing the idea of circular economy. That's how that happened. And again, we have been so gratified with how successful it has been, because this is such a new concept in Canada that this could have easily not had any success at all. And again, credit to those communities, how positive they were and how much they embraced the concept and really helped to make it happen. So the stage we're at now, just so you know, so what we did over the first year was we got people together in those communities. And it's important to recognize that it's not just the waste management people. It's people in all different departments within the community that we bring them together. You can only imagine how interested a group like economic development would be, for example. But we really brought in a wide range of departments and had a workshop at each of these communities where we, really introduced the concept and then put them to work and sat down and discussed, okay, what do you have today in your community? And where do you see the opportunities for us to bring some of these concepts in? Like how can you do things slightly differently? And they were so engaged. And as a result, we got these great results from these workshops. And then what we did is we developed what we call roadmaps that looked at, here's what they have, here's some of the ideas, here's some of the things that they could do going forward, and develop this roadmap that now they can take and implement in their community.
So yeah, what I hear, like when people get asked, their ideas, that the creativity just comes out, and I think it's great, right? Because there's not a lot of places where you can actually bring that forward, and to get an idea of what does that look like, what are the kind of initiatives you're seeing that are, the low-hanging fruit that they're starting with first inside this kind of conversation.
This is what's interesting is because of the different communities, they have different priorities, they have different realities. So we never got out in front of them to make any assumptions about what could or couldn't work in their community. So we let them talk it through and come up with, and this was why it was so important to get the right people and a broad range of people at these workshops, so they could really brainstorm, okay, what can we do? How can we actually have success? And so then, but remember, this is at a fairly high level, the idea of, like even identifying the things that are already there. But to give you an example, one of the really super keen communities coming out of this was the town of Banff. And so the town of Banff now has these great ideas, creating this public space that becomes it becomes partly a lending library where people can actually come to one place, and they can, again, you come back to the idea of the tool libraries, that they can get the resources that they need. Not only that, but they have space where they can actually make these things happen. And that can also become a space that is about education, about learning, and about how you can actually start to integrate these ideas like on the ground in that community. So that's an example of what Banff saw as a way of delivering the things that they had talked about and the things that had come out of that workshopping experience.
Okay, so yeah, pretty innovative things, and I hear what a community can do when you bring it together, right? And I love that idea. Instead of having all this stuff that, I need to get rid of stuff, I can't use it. Imagine having a space where you could bring it, and someone maybe can't afford it or doesn't need it enough to buy it can just use it when they need to. It's that's a
Yes.
beautiful model.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and again, so exciting when you think about the, a community really engaging in this kind of option.
Yeah, and I hear it really is going to take us redesigning kind of the current model, which is very much a you buy it, packaging goes in the garbage, you use the thing for a year and it goes in the garbage, and
Yeah.
that's a whole other different model, right? And then there's a whole the manufacturers getting into it, and I love the idea that you mentioned about that lease part where you don't necessarily buy something and throw it out, but you literally lease it, and then when you're done with it, you give it back, and then it gets built so it can easily be repaired or
Yeah.
refurbished. So that's a bit bigger system design for sure.
Absolutely. And again, it's a different way of looking at it because we have been so enthralled now for years with the idea of owning stuff. But when you look at the stuff that we own, most of it we don't need. We do not need that stuff. We don't need the thing. We do not need the thing. We are so attached to the idea of owning things. But what we need is we need the service that thing provides. We don't need the thing at all. In fact, the thing just gets in the way. And if it not only gets in the way, but it can break, and there's all of these downsides. So the idea of buying the service instead of buying the thing completely changes the equation. And you're right, it makes the manufacturer then start to pay attention to, well, you know what, this thing's going to land back on my doorstep. I better make one that's actually going to last a while or that is repairable. So rather than just I'm going to make it as cheap as possible so that somebody will buy it because all they care about is price. No, I'm going to pay attention now to what the durability of that thing is and what its real functionality is. And at the end of the day, what you and I end up with is we end up with a lot better things. We don't own them, but they're a lot better. They're more durable. They're more functional. They're probably better looking. We're going to be overall, our experience with them is going to be so much more positive.
Okay. Now, what do you see is it going to take to shift this current paradigm? And I see there's definitely these initiatives, and you're starting to see the new paradigm. What it's going to take to really have that shift to a circular economy? Definitely initiatives that you're doing, getting the cities involved. Like, what do you see is it going to take for that to really happen?
Yeah, and that's actually a very tough question because this is what happens with activities that is disruptive is you don't even necessarily always know what the barriers are, but that's one of the key things is we need to make sure that we don't put up barriers to some of these things that we actually want to see happen. And some of our existing regulations, Car2Go had that experience where it was difficult for them to get into certain marketplaces because there were barriers. So the more that we can try to tear down these barriers so that these new approaches actually are embraced rather than resisted, that is huge. That's absolutely huge. And that's a role that regulators can play for sure. But not only regulators, but this is also about the community as a whole and about individuals, that we are open to these new ideas. And so you'll see it's interesting because what we're seeing out there is we are seeing a lot of leadership as well from the business community. And because you look at things like let's go back to Loop again. If we look at Loop, somebody's taking a chance by saying, yeah, you know what, I think people would like to buy their ice cream in this absolutely beautiful stainless steel container, and yeah, they'll pay a deposit and they'll bring it back, and they're gonna, like, again, that's a risk, but it takes leadership to offer that. And so we're starting to see more of those. We're starting to see leadership from some of the larger corporations, for example, but we're also seeing a lot of innovation from entrepreneurs. So we need to make sure that we're also embracing some of these new ideas that entrepreneurs come up with, because again, that's where a lot of these disruptive ideas may come from, and they may not work all the time, but boy, some of them may be the next best mousetrap that really is going to make a difference for us in getting to a circular economy.
Yeah, and I think you got the strategy right? Because starting at that community or city level, right? Because you have these partnerships that can form between the businesses, the city, and at least you take care of a lot of the rules, and then the city at least can bring things up to the government level, right? Which a businesses might have a hard time doing, or an individual can. So I think that's the right approach.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that's where, these communities like the ones that are part of our Circular Cities initiative, these communities really become not only leaders, but they become facilitators. They become facilitators that really can foster these new ideas. So that's important, really important.
Yeah. So I hear in Alberta, your organization is definitely a lead organization in making this happen. Is there an equivalent organization like that in most provinces, like a recycling council or a circular economy council?
Yeah, there is something equivalent in most of the provinces. Some of them are directly related to, being formerly recycling or waste in some way. But there are, at the very least, there are these environmental organizations of some kind. So all of those can really be engaged as facilitators of this kind of concept.
Okay. Yeah. So I really hear anybody listening that wants to get involved. Those are great organizations to look into, see what they've got, and connect. And it sounds like the more and more people in this conversation, the more we'll see this happen.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, and it's interesting because when you start to get these things kind of filtering in, it's amazing how you can really see people are really ready for this now, and so you'll see them being very positive about, yeah, you know what, this is actually a really good idea, and I'm going to support this, and that is absolutely critical too, because when these new ideas come out on the market, how they are received at the consumer level is very important. And I think we have the right paradigm now where that is going to be much more positively received. And again, and you just need that core group of people that really embrace it, because once they do, and it gets a foundation, then it starts to really trickle down. And we appear to have that now, and that is super exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, because you can see how many people have taken on to recycling, and especially, some people got jaded by a bit of, okay, what happens to my recycling, right? Because you made the good point at the beginning where that system is not necessarily doing it. And that's where moving to a circular economy system really fixes that system. So we make sure that it actually goes back. And I think you're right. I think people are just like all on board or ready to jump on it if it's available.
Absolutely. And it's important for us to recognize that recycling is not an environmental panacea. It is only one tool in the toolbox, and we need to really embrace these other approaches too if we're going to have success.
I love it. And is there anything you'd like to leave with our listeners before we end our conversation?
No, I think just think circular and think outside the box, but be open to these new ideas that are innovative, and they may be disruptive, but they're really how we're going to get where we need to go in the future. And I think it's where we need to be, it's where we need to go. So we all need to play a role in making that happen.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, and continue with the great work. It's definitely something that is needed. And
you are so welcome.
We'll talk to you soon.
It's been a complete pleasure. Yes.
All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day in your solarium in Alberta.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
To hear more about our podcasts, showcase events, or the Futureproof Network, please visit us at www.futureproof-network.com.